Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your patience. I think we'll get underway now. My name is Andrew Yip, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Art Gallery of New South Wales this afternoon for the 2014 Dundas Memorial Lecture, Writing a History of Australian Art. Now, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. Inaugurated in memory of artists Douglas Dundas and Dorothy Thornhill, and first held in 1983 with an address by James Gleeson, the purpose of the Dundas Memorial Lecture is to bring to light significant new scholarship on the history of Australian art. After a long period of absence, in 2012, the Gallery revived the lecture program for a new audience and a new time, inviting Julie Ewington, then Curatorial Manager of Australian Art at the Queensland Art Gallery, to speak to the topic of women artists in Australia in light of her landmark exhibition, Contemporary Australia Women. In 2014, the Gallery has invited Professor Sasha Grishin from the Australian National University to present the Dundas Lecture in light of his recent magnum opus, Australian Art, A History. There have been numerous histories of Australian art published by William Moore in 1934, Herbert Badham, 1949, Bernard Smith, 1962, Robert Hughes, and more recently, Christopher Allen, Andrew Sayers, and John McDonald. All have been of their time and place, and each has brought a particular focus to the narrative of Australian art. So why a new history and why now? In this lecture, Sasha will discuss what distinguishes his new survey from its predecessors. At over 600 pages, the book presents a detailed analysis of the development of Australian art. It commences with ancient Aboriginal rock art and early colonialists' interpretations of their surroundings, and moves on to discuss the formation of an Australian identity through art, the shock of early modernism, and the notorious Heidi Circle. It finishes with the popular recognition of modern Indigenous art and contemporary Australian art and its place in the world, reading Indigenous and non-Indigenous art as an ongoing dialectic. Sasha is an adjunct professor of art history at the Australian National University. He established the discipline of art history there in 1977 and was the Sir William Dobell Professor of Art History until December 2013. He studied at the universities of Melbourne, Moscow, London, and Oxford, and has served several terms as a visiting scholar at Harvard University. In 2004, he was elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. In 2005, he was awarded the Order of Australia for services to Australian art and art history. He's published over 25 books, I'm told, and many, many scholarly essays and articles. Please join me in welcoming Sasha to the stage.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you very much, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, for inviting me to deliver the 2014 Dundas Memorial Lecture. It's an honour. Well, the first question I want to start with, quite obviously, and it's something I need to justify to myself, why spend a decade of one's life writing a new history of Australian art? And I also would like to, if you like, justify to you why, and just why, it may be worth reading. Now, as Andrew mentioned, there have been a number of histories of Australian art, all published over the past 70 years. The first by William Moore in 1934, then by Herbert Badham in 1949, Bernard Smith's major contribution in 1962, Robert Hughes, 1966, Christopher Allen in 1997, Andrew Sayers, 2001, and John McDonald, the first volume of an ongoing publication, appeared in 2008. There's also been the invaluable Alan McCulloch Encyclopedia of Australian Art, first published in 1968, and the fourth edition of which was published in 2006. And then literally a tsunami of internet resources, most valuable of which are the various public gallery websites, including the one of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and the very useful Design and Art Australia online website. So, in what ways is my book different? Now, while most of the published histories of Australian art adopt an apartheid-like separation between Indigenous art and non-Indigenous art, this one examines the two strands as a form of an ongoing dialectic in Australian art. I argue that Aboriginal art had a direct impact on the art of the First Fleet artists and has continued to do so to a greater or lesser extent through to the present day. Reciprocally, Indigenous art also accommodated non-Indigenous aspects of art, whether this be from Asia, such as Macassan art, or from Europe. And imagery, techniques of art production, and modes of visualization all reflect this. Now, this is not a question of assimilation or integration, but as I say, an ongoing dialectic, almost like a game of ping pong, where ideas between artists bounce off one another. Now, it would be silly to bring out the concept, the colonial concept of authenticity, that somehow the purity of art is contaminated if it learns from other traditions. Now, this notion that a great tradition of art is only authentic if it is fossilized in noble isolation belongs to the realm of tooth fairies. A living tradition of art survives in a state of flux and development, and it is this that gives its vitality and its continuing authenticity. If one wanted to present a conceptual framework in a diagrammatic way, I would envisage the interrelationship more like a spiral than a straight line, where at times contact and interdependence is strongest, and at times when it is least evident. For example, I would argue that the impact of Indigenous art on the non-Indigenous tradition is most evident in first contact art. In early modernism, just think of someone like Margaret Preston, Ian Fairweather, or Tony Tuckson, and contemporary art. And perhaps is least evident during the art of the so-called Heidelberg School, or academic modernism. Just think of Arthur Streeton and George Bell. To some extent, I argue that this is one of the factors which gives Australian art its distinctive character. Now, I won't so much address the images because they're fairly self-evident of an Indigenous version of a Macassan vessel, or the so-called Port Jackson artist or painter very much responding directly to Aboriginal art. If we glance for a second at the most authoritative and the longest lasting of these publications on Australian art history, the wonderful squeaky classic by Bernard Smith. The title tells you everything. Australian Painting, 1788 to 1960. So it's a book about Australian painting, painting only, and only since European settlement. And at least in the original edition of 1962, it focuses on the non-Indigenous tradition of Australian painting. Subsequently, editions of 1971, 1991, and 2001 have included additional material, but the core text dealing with Australian painting up to 1960 remains unchanged and uncorrected. My Australian Art of History examines not only Indigenous and non-Indigenous art, but also printmaking, sculpture, photography, performance art, installation art, studio ceramics, and so on. What we can refer to as a broad and ongoing tradition of visual culture. It is easy to say what I do not consider, things like commercial design, mainstream domestic architecture, most aspects of commercial cinema, with the exception of posters, most forms of advertising, television programs, and so on. While many accounts, especially those of Hughes, Allen, and Sayers, present a very short survey text, quite often excellent in what they set out to do, but there's very little room to develop an argument, and certainly no attempt possible at any sense of comprehensiveness. This new book consists of about 300,000 words and roughly 600 pages, and presents a detailed analysis of the development of Australian art from ancient rock art through to the present. Of course, it's only promotional publishers' blurbs in which publications can be described as comprehensive and definitive. This one, at least, is quite long and extensive, giving the author a greater, and I like this word, maneuverability. Or if you want to employ a sporting metaphor, this book is more akin to a marathon as opposed to a sprint of the books I mentioned above. Nevertheless, painful decisions had to be made as to whom to include and whom to exclude, whom to discuss, and which reproductions to use as illustrations. The whole thing is a bit of a minefield when you arrive at the more contemporary period. And I know that people have been offended and have felt rejected. I'll say a bit more about this slightly later. The truth is that my publishers asked for a considerably shorter manuscript from the one which was delivered. And although they've been wonderful in accommodating this author's extravagant appetite, in the end about 100,000 words hit the cutting room floor, and most of these words, of course, were from the contemporary area. Bigger does not necessarily mean better, and bouts of verbal diarrhea should not be confused with making a meaningful contribution to art scholarship. I've suggested already that the book which I have written incorporates both Indigenous and non-Indigenous art into a single narrative account of Australian art, and that this account goes across mediums and across time, rather than adhering to the traditional construct of Australian art as a history of easel painting until postmodernism, and subsequently as a history of photographically based installation art. A key underlying purpose of the book was the conviction that Australian art, at its best, stands up well to any international company. And the book was designed as an act of advocacy for Australian art. This idea of a narrative, or telling a story, in my mind, required a single narrator. This, of course, is highly contentious. Common sense suggests that one could more easily write this book through a committee, a sort of an anthology, where anywhere between, say, 20 and 50 authors would write an essay on their area of expertise. Well, personally, I hate committees. Anthologies may be useful within an academic community, but when you're trying to make a case for Australian art, you need a storyline and a narrator who will tell this story. One voice, one author, not a herding of cats. Of course, by adopting and opting to be a single author, this does not imply that the book was written in solitude and isolation. In the 7 years or so that I devoted to physically writing this book, I spent many, many months working in the National Gallery of Australia Research Library, where I was surrounded by a dedicated professional staff, many of whom are my former students, and also spent a couple of years at the State Library of Victoria, who offered me a creative fellowship, which came with a room of my own with a view. Much of the material in this book draws on the work of scholars who came before me. I stand tall because I'm standing on their shoulders. Hence the enormous but still very incomplete bibliography. More importantly, there are many hundreds of artists, possibly thousands, who have allowed me into their lives and into their studios. You know, you learn much more about art in an artist's studio than you do in any library. Subsequently, I created my council of 20 elders. It's just grown. Experts in the field to whom I sent drafts of my chapters for comment. Without their input, this would have been a much poorer book. Now, these are some of the mechanics involved in the writing of the book. And I've also said something concerning some of my intentions for writing the book. Perhaps now, I'd like to make a few comments about some of the conclusions which arose in the process of work. Although I may have had no intention of revising the canon, perhaps unwittingly, I observed that while working through the material, I could no longer support some of the assessments and the value judgments made by earlier scholars. Let me provide a couple of examples. A close examination of Australian etchings in the first half of the 20th century led me to the inevitable conclusion that one could no longer speak of the outstanding superiority of Lionel Lindsay or Normal Lindsay or Sidney Long or Sidney Erskine Smith, but the outstanding etcher of this period was in fact a woman, who was not even mentioned in Bernard Smith's book. And this is the wonderful Jessie Trail. I actually asked Bernard, why didn't you mention Jessie Trail's work? And he said, well, when I was researching my book in the 1950s, no one spoke about her. I wasn't aware of her. Drawing on the conventions of Frank Brangwyn, Trail made prints which were big, beautiful, and dramatic. This one is from her series that she did on the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. By contrast, I'm showing you a contemporary etching by the much promoted male etcher of the time, Lionel Lindsay. You'll notice that the etching is about 1/4 of the size. It is finely crafted, and it looks back in time. You may discover a majority of Lindsay's etchings in their titles incorporate the word old. This is a fact. I just went through a catalogue raisonné and looked it up. Well, many of Trail's etchings look forward, such as the building of the new Sydney Harbour Bridge, or the building of the new powerhouse stations, which were designed to power domestic Australia into the post-war future. Jessie Trail had this beautiful breadth of vision, so that she moved from powerful images of industrial progress to lyrical images of the Australian bush. In contrast with most of the etchings which were being produced in Australia by the male etchers, Trail's were outstanding in scale, their dramatic sense of presence, and in her imagery. Her beautiful Victims of 1914 is a large and dramatic composition, where two workers are shown in the process of ring-barking huge towering gums in a forest. When it was exhibited in the Panama Pacific International Exhibition in San Francisco in 1914, Traill was awarded the gold medal. And in the same year, it was also exhibited at the Royal Academy in London. Although politically conservative, Traill was an active environmentalist who realized that we were destroying our own natural environment. And she was a member of the Men of the Tree Society, the Australian Forest League, and the Beaumaris Tree Protection Society. Beautiful Victims, I find, is a striking image where there is a starkness in design and where a lyricism is combined with a dramatic brutality. The two forest workers are dwarfed by the majestic trees they have condemned to death. And the labour of man is not shown as a sign of progress, the taming of the wilderness for the benefit of humanity, but as an act of wanton destruction. Some of Traill's bush imagery, including this superbly lyrical Good Night in the Gully where the white gums grow of 1922, many of the ingredients of the Brangwen manner, Frank Brangwen was, of course, the great English etcher and artist, they've been brought together with a bold, deeply bitten image, including the use of brown ink and the use of buff papers. It's an image of remarkable poetic resonance, where the truncated saplings in the foreground lead into an area of dark and mysterious aquatint. A second example is the case with the very significant South Australian-born modernist, printmaker and painter Dorrit Black. Although, unlike Jessie Traill, she does get a mention in Bernard Smith's classic account, but it's only in passing, and only to mention that she established the Modern Arts Centre in Margaret Street in Sydney in the 1930s, and this is only mentioned because Ralph Bolson's first solo exhibition was held there. Like Margaret Preston, Dorrit Black was born in South Australia. Like Preston, she travelled abroad and turned to modernism. And like Preston, she settled for a while in Sydney, where she had a major impact in the reception of modernism in general and the understanding of Cubism in particular. One of Black's earliest liner cuts, Music, of 1928, presents a brilliant synthesis of dynamic modernism, with its origins in vorticism and cubism, and the forms encountered in Claude Flight's work of the time. Claude Flight was this pioneering printmaker working primarily in liner cuts at the Grosvenor School, which Dorrit Black attended. It also incorporates the rhythmic elegance of Henri Matisse's Dance and Music, both of 1910, and the flat decorative angularity and spiky forms favoured by Art Deco. Black's inspiration may have stemmed from a jazz night at the Dominion Arts Club in London, but all has been transformed by the frenzied and agitated forms of the naked dancing figures and the naked pianist, printed from 5 blocks. In this work, Black maintains a surface tension, where, despite the figurative content, it is basically resolved as a beautifully abstracted formalist image. Flight included this print in his annual exhibition of liner cuts held in London at the Redfern Gallery in 1929, and wrote to Black in a letter, "I think it very good. I especially like the person at the piano. I think you got away with the idea very well." The Bridge, 1930, was painted shortly after Dorrit Black's return to Australia from study in Europe, and is one of her most accomplished paintings. with a markedly flattened cubist space, geometrically arranged masses, and a restricted palette. Unlike her contemporaries in Sydney, Roland Wakelin and Grace Cossington Smith, who also attempted the same subject within a modernist framework, Black's painting is fully resolved and contained, yet maintains an emotive and expressionist content. So what did Dorrit Black do wrong to earn such neglect by posterity? Well, basically two things. Firstly, she decided to look after her ailing mother, and after their return from their final trip to Europe in 1935, she settled permanently in the Adelaide Hills, where she was a huge fish in a small pond, and had a profound impact on a number of emerging local artists, including Geoffrey Smart. So in other words, a hint: if you want to succeed in Australian art, don't live in Adelaide. Live exclusively in Sydney or Melbourne. Otherwise, posterity won't notice you. Secondly, she moved away from mysticism that had informed much of her earlier practice and became a socialist and joined the Australian Labor Party. Second clue. Unlike Margaret Preston, she never married, so she could not employ her husband's money to buy for herself a higher public profile or use her fiery temper to ward off hostile critics. Finally, she made the final mistake by dying too early in a car accident in 1951, and Preston was to outlive her by another dozen years. It's the strength, power, and the significance of her art that forces the reevaluation. And I just put in those two images without much comment: the eruption, based of course her experiences of Mount Vesuvius, and what is an absolute masterpiece in terms of cubist arrangement of form, her pot plant lino cut of 33. As you would notice, that my first two examples of rewriting the history of Australian art, Jessie Trail and Dorrit Black, have a number of things in common. Both were women artists, and both were not exclusively easel painters. My final example somewhat supports the same pattern. Joy Hester has a single comment in Bernard Smith's history in a longish list of artists who he could have mentioned, but whom he chose not to. Yet I'd like to argue that Hester was arguably one of the most important artists of her generation. Born in Melbourne in 1920, and belonging to the same generation as Arthur Boyd, Yossel Bergner, and John Brack, and only slightly younger than Albert Tucker and Sidney Nolan, and friends with all of these, Hester remained outside the mainstream developments. In terms of gender, she was obviously the odd woman out within this heavily male-dominated radical modernist community. When listed amongst the contributors to the Angry Penguins, she is described as, and I quote, Joy Hester, peroxide blonde, in her early 20s, former pupil of the Melbourne Gallery, natural and prolific draftsman, writes poetry, married to painter A.L. Tucker. That's all she's mentioned. The other major impediment to Hester's recognition was the choice of medium. The history of modernism in Australia in the 1940s was largely written in terms of easel painting, whether it be the oil paintings of Boyd and Tucker or the crisp, shiny enamels of Nolan. Hester produced very few paintings. Her preferred medium was drawing, using inks, watercolors, and gouaches, and producing other works on paper. Furthermore, her image was internalized, and rather than making grand statements concerning the human condition, it dealt with intimate relationships, loneliness, and sexuality, and revealed a morbid fascination with death and a preoccupation with psychological states dealing with pain. Longevity was also not on her side, as in 1947, Hester was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 27. And for the remaining 13 years of her life, she lived outside of Melbourne, in self-imposed exile, away from the significant artistic developments. Her illness and lifestyle kept her away from the main artistic groupings. Nor did she migrate overseas like Boyd, Nolan, and Tucker to find the crown of recognition and to return home to collect back pay and acknowledgement. Hester in her youth thrived on notoriety. She bragged of her rebellious behavior, flexible relationships, numerous abortions, and has posthumously been championed by feminist art historians as a neglected great in Australian art. Many of her drawings, including this Two Girls in a Street of 41, deal with distressed psychological states, as do the works of Tucker and Boyd. But here they're seen from a much more introverted and feminine perspective. After schooling at St. Michael's Church of England Grammar School in St Kilda, Hester spent about a year in Melbourne's National Gallery School. However, the most important artistic influence on her life was an encounter with Danila Vasiliev in September of 1937, and the meeting with Tucker the following year, while she was still 17 years old, with whom she formed a relationship and married. Possibly the most incisive comment on her attitude to urban environment is found in some of her poems written in 1942. She writes, "The shifting feet and restless eye of those that stand by hydrants in city streets, for youth has fled and lust is all their heritage. On all they depend. Unremembering children laugh and dance a jagged way. Before the glance is cast, they do not see the eyes that linger, seductive. Beyond their trailing skirts and merry feet, I see it already late, too late. They too await their fate. As strangers pass, hydrants at depth of night." Now, this collection of poetry contains only fragments and impressions, but they certainly, I think, the fragments evoke the sense of threatening associations of life within an urban setting. In terms of formal influences, Vasiliev and his images of the inner suburban streets of Melbourne, he was the artist, had the most profound impact on her development. And while she made relatively few pronouncements on art, in 1959, a year before her own death, she wrote on the occasions of Vasiliev's memorial exhibition, "Vasiliev was both a teacher and a seer, but he had no time for theories. Painting for him was a life force, never an intellectual activity. And his life and work were continuous explosions, fusing, coordinating, and illuminating the basis of his creative force and the full power of his direction, making him an artist of great quality." The faces encountered in Hester's art were not portraits of Smith. She met the artist after she broke off with Albert Tucker. She had a son, Sweeney, whom she left permanently in the care of Sunday Reed. She had been by this stage diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, the terminal cancer of the lymph glands, and she employed heroin as a way to control her pain. She also embarked on a strange and penetrating series of faces at around the same time, to which some extent, following on from the series of drawings titled Gethsemane, relating to Sunday Reed's Faceless Doll, or by that name, which was one of the discussion focal points around Heidi. The faces encountered in Hester's art were not portraits. They did not denote anyone specific, but an expression of the human experience, or in her words, the fleeting, mobile moment. It was a form of expressionist surrealism, where increasingly the eye became detached from the socket and is suspended on its own stalk, as in her remarkable drawing Girl with Hen of 1956, which could be an expression of her experience of life in the countryside. In her monograph devoted to the artist, Janine Burke notes, in Freudian terms, the all-powerful, all-seeing eye becomes a phallic eye, and certainly the shape and thrust of the disconnected eye form is recognizable as a phallus. To carry this interpretation further on a sexually symbolic level, the severed or disconnected eye is placed on a decapitated head, which can denote castration. Interpretations of Hester's later work abound with references to the occult and to forms of mysticism. She herself noted that somehow, when I put brush to paper, I start with the eye, do the eye, and the rest is dictated by that. By the time Hester returned to Melbourne after a short stay in Sydney, Albert Tucker had left for Europe, and so had the Reeds, taking her son Sweeney with them. Hester remained with her new love Smith at Hurstbridge, where they had a son Peregrine in 1951 and then a daughter Fern 3 years later. They then moved further into the Dandenongs to Avonsley, where they finally got married in 1959 after Tucker granted Hester a divorce. She died several months later in 1960. When Hester died at the age of 40, not a single work of hers was held in a public collection. And she's little known outside the small circle of friends, particularly around Heidi. In the final analysis, she was a humanist artist, conscious of the existentialist heritage, and her lovers, women in claustrophobic spaces, and introspective heads all speak of the pain of being. It is a tragic outlook on life and sexuality, akin to the vision of Edvard Munch, yet seen from a distinctly feminine perspective. The immediacy of the drawn line, the nervous, anxious struggling to assert its existence, become the hallmarks of her work. The awareness of line is neither an expression of technical inability nor insecurity, but demonstrates hard-won gains, a struggle against facility, and a conscious attempt to make the mark intense and pregnant with feeling. In her juvenile work, Hester turned to the sculptors Henri Gautier-Breschke and Henry Moore for assistance. But in the final decade of her life, she developed a striking purity and originality. A drawing such as Man and Woman in Bed, of probably about 1952 onwards, finds few parallels in Australian art for its sense of visionary intensity and lightness of touch. It is the force and strength of her vision that prevailed upon me and caused me to insert her into my account of the history of the development of Australian art. At the beginning of the lecture, I spoke of the intention for my book and what one could term something of the conceptual makeup and some of the methodologies involved. Subsequently, I spoke what a Marxist critic could refer to as an act of revisionism, where the existing paradigms for Australian art history received a bit of a shake-up. And quite a number of artists, predominantly female, floated to the surface, while others deservedly sunk to the bottom of the pile. And I've argued that they did not quite perhaps deserve the earlier ranking, or simply that their 15 minutes had expired. Well, of course, my judgments in art in this part of the book will be, and have already been, challenged. But they are made in the light of hindsight and built on exhibitions, publications, and reassessments also made by other people working in Australian art. Finally, I'd like to say a few words concerning the last part of the book, the impossible bit, the suicidal quest. How can one write an account of contemporary art where there is no history, no test of time? The short answer is, with great difficulty and at personal threat to the safety of the writer involved. The more I worked on this project, the more I realized how impossible was the task. Do you know how many professional artists there are presently alive and presently working in the visual arts in Australia today? Well, after a considerable amount of research, with the help of NAVA, the ATO, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the correct figure is between 25 and 35,000. This is artists who are represented in public collections and who exhibit regularly in professional gallery spaces. In short, in writing on contemporary Australian art, you're guaranteed to make at least 20 or 30,000 enemies. There is no way out. So my task changed as to how to broaden the consultative process. Although it is my head which is on the chopping block, I did want to get a bit more feedback on what was happening in contemporary art. So after much agonizing, I came up with a list of names of prominent artists, aged between 30 and 90, about equal gender and spread throughout Australia. I had a list of about 80 of them, and I invited each of them in complete confidentiality to write for me a list, in no particular order, of 50 contemporary living artists who they thought were making a significant contribution to contemporary art practice in this country, in any medium in the visual arts. This, for me, was to be the artist's voice in the book. Fortunately, because I have a winning smile, 68 artists agreed to participate, well, actually 69, but one tripped over his own ego, and I assembled a simple Excel spreadsheet and was struck by the degree of consensus. Sometimes comments appeared, unsolicited ones, of course. For example, concerning a certain artist in Tasmania, I really don't like her and I don't really like her work, but I think she's very important. In most instances, art was a higher calling than personal egos. And visual literacy amongst the participants made the process easier. In the meantime, a couple of the artists suggested that perhaps it would be useful to make a second list of artists, a list of those whom they considered were over-promoted and should be excluded from any discussion of contemporary serious art practice in this country. So I invited my artists to provide the second list, and most obliged, and said that they found it much easier to compile the second list than they did the first. So colloquially in my working practice, these became known, sorry for this bit of art historical jargon, those of you who are art historians will understand it. The first one was referred to as the hit list, and the second one was referred to as the shit list. And this informed my selection of artists for detailed discussion and noting in the book. Curators, leading art administrators, and a select number of commercial gallery directors were also drawn into my consultative process. Thank you all. Your confidentiality has been respected, and as promised, all correspondence has been destroyed. I need to stress that the final decision was taken by me and me alone, but a wide consultative process was undertaken, and wise counsel had been sought. I've not seriously looked at the book since it's been published, but easily realised that in a second edition, which will happen once this one sells out, I will need to add at least another 100 pages to the contemporary art practice section to restore a greater sense of balance. My publishers inform me that the book is selling exceptionally well, and a second edition is now becoming increasingly a likelihood. So I conclude my talk with two artists who have a considerable profile in my final section. Inga King, I argue, is a hugely significant artist on the contemporary sculpture scene, and presently in her 99th year, so she's hardly a spring chicken. But she's not an artist who made some of her best work when she was in her 30s and now is simply repeating herself. She has made some of her best art in the past decade and is presently involved in a major monumental project. Unlike most sculptors in Australia, she has consistently been committed to sculpture as a public art. Not sculpture as a commemorative memorial, nor sculpture as a private venue for personal gratification or display of arcane knowledge or esoteric symbols. Without succumbing to the temptation of making popularist sculpture, which would cater for the lowest common denominator with mimetic copies of popular icons, Inga King has made sculpture which created new icons with which people have been able to identify and which people could enjoy and use in their daily lives. His sculptures have become icons in Australian cultural landscape. They have become landmarks within cities and refuges in the non-urban areas. There is a conceptual trajectory in the development of Inga King's artistic vision. Initially, she sought the tools and the morphology to relate a sculptural narrative relevant to Australia, one which had neither a nationalistic chauvinism nor one that depended on simplistic branding. There were a number of false starts and even more interruptions thrown up by life before a suitable medium was determined and a technology mastered. Subsequently, she managed to establish her own independent artistic identity, which reflected the zeitgeist, but maintained an individual, distinctive, and feminine voice. She mastered the formalist language without becoming a formulaic formalist. The obsessive dedication to her art led to the creation of some of the most striking and significant public sculptures in this country. Later in life, after an outburst of joyous celebration of life forces, with dance, music, and sonorous notes of colour, her preoccupation changed from the physical and the emotional to the spiritual and the transcendental, in such pieces like this huge Rings of Saturn at Heidi in Melbourne. Her celestial imagery, which appeared in the opening years of the new century, increasingly and successfully engaged with the ideas of the spiritual in art. Unlike much of the art which engages with the anagogical dimension and becomes preoccupied with death and with eschatological themes, Inga King's late spiritualism affirms the beauty and joy of being and creation. In the same way as she found inspiration in the angels of Paul Klee, for whom they were the harbingers of death, and which she converted into symbols of life and joy. Her late celestial pieces celebrate our being in a beautiful and ever-expanding universe. The final artist to whom I refer to in this lecture is Pat Brassington, who studied both printmaking and photography at the Tasmanian School of Art in the 1970s and the 1980s. She has become a nationally recognised photo-based artist, and her imagery exists in that ambiguous space where the nexus between the image as reality and image as fantasy is completely fluid. Truncated limbs, subversive pinks, female lingerie are some of the elements in Brasington's repertoire, which she employs to make her unsettling and disturbing images. Elements of the intimate female anatomy and the domestic interior settings dominate the iconography of prints. She exploits the literalness of the photographic image, which acts as a touchstone on reality. Yet through the process of digital montaging, inventing and seamlessly splicing and juxtaposing selected elements, she creates an artifice that denies the potential for a voyeuristic reading of her prints or installation pieces. She has a very distinctive feminist vision, which informs her art, and one in which the abject and the sublime collide, creating that which is simultaneously seductively attractive and deeply disturbing, and at times repulsive. When commenting on her art practice, she describes it as a combining of her interest in psychoanalysis and surrealism and her own personal experiences, and this provides, and I quote, a rationale for my images of fantasy. Conscious of the writings of Sigmund Freud on the uncanny, as well as the broader psychoanalytical discourse, the success of her images lies in part in the creation of a tension between feelings of attraction and revulsion, delight and the abject, the sense of the familiar and the disturbing exotic, which the viewer encounters in these objects of desire. An image such as Boucher of 2001 from the Gentle series at first glance seems to marry harmoniously parts of the human anatomy. A tuft of pubic hair in the lower part, in the center of the composition, begs for an anatomical reading of the image as the human body. But a small, ambiguous element of flesh seems to penetrate and violate the bodily parts. This note of disharmony galvanizes our attention as we're drawn into the image. The word boucher, employed in the title, itself has the connotations in French, of course, of butcher, le boucher, or as the verb to cork, plug, or block, all adding to a mounting sense of menace and violation. The art object itself, designated by the artist as a pigment print, belongs as much to the realm of photography as to printmaking. The digital has been employed not so much for the seamless splicing of anatomical members to create a new mutant being, but also to create an immaculate facade and a sense of restraint where the artist never shows a hand. There's nothing here that is not a photographic record of a tangible object, except for the subtle manipulation of the image and its color resolution. The digital process allows Brasington to present this transfigured reality as a new actuality. Well, after working on the book for about a decade, now that it's been published, I can only see the flaws and the places where I could have and should have done better. Nevertheless, I hope that you'll be able to see this volume as a singular act of advocacy for Australian art. My basic contention remains that Australian art at its best compares favourably to art anywhere in the world, and it's time for us to get behind it and to make the strongest case that we can for it. That was my intention. Thank you.